Hi, everyone. I'm Jace Chambers. I handle all the education and community engagement here at Opera Lafayette, and we are so excited to have you for our session of Education in the Time of Esther, one of our Salon series before our Esther performance, coming to DC next week, actually, on the 8th, and coming to New York May 9th. This evening, we have a great scholar, and of course, one of our famous artists who we love working with, Jonathan Woody. And I'm going to go ahead and let Ryan do some introductions.
Thanks, Jace, and hello, everyone. I have the great pleasure of having with me here both Benjamin Bernard, who does need an introduction because it's the first time that he's been working with us, and yet he's come to several of our concerts, and we've struck up a lot of conversations which have really have led to this moment. And it turns out that this concert is really right down his alley, as you'll see. Benjamin is a PhD as an historian of early modern France at the University of Virginia. And he received his doctorate in 2022 from Princeton Department of History. And his dissertation was called Administering Morals in the French Enlightenment, Education, Sexuality, and Authority at the Parisian College, 1645 to 1763. So his expertise will plays into our program. He has both studied in France and in the United States, and he's both taught in France and the United States, and he spends a good deal of time in both countries still. As a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Virginia, he teaches 2 interdisciplinary seminars, and I thought I'd give you the titles of them because they were so interesting: Decadence, The Ethics of Excess, and You Are Who You Meet, The History of Friendship, which I thought was particularly interesting, and I'd like to be a fly on the wall of that seminar, Ben. He also has been producing a podcast, Sister Revolutions, which compares the histories of Charlottesville, Virginia, and its French sister city of Besançon during the American and French Revolutions. And he's been published in various places, and in his spare time, he plays squash and the sackbut. So I thought those were notable things for an academic. We love it when the scholars we work with are also active musicians, and so you'll have to bring your sackbut to the next program, Ben. And as Jay said, Jonathan Woody doesn't need much of an introduction. Jonathan is a bass baritone who first worked with us almost 20, well, actually more than 20 years ago now, and has been more recently not only a soloist with Opera Lafayette and of course many organizations around the world. He just flew back from Europe, where he was recording with the Boston Early Music Festival, and we'll mention something about that because it's pertinent to today's program later. And of course, we call him an artistic associate of Opera Lafayette because he has helped organize a number of programs, and he has worked with Justin Taylor and will be working with Justin Taylor over the next week to produce this wonderful program of excerpts from both Moreau and Handel's Esther. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Ben and take it away.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for that lovely introduction. The history of friendship class is particularly my favorite. The students just love talking about how friendship has changed over time and how they can use the insights of the past to help them think about their own friendships in college. Can I ask the folks in the audience, are you able to see and hear me okay? And can you also see my slides? Okay.
Yes, and yes.
Thank you so much. If you feel comfortable doing so and you're able to turn your camera on, that's also very helpful for me to be able to see you all kind of responding and nodding and so on, if you're at a comfortable place to be able to do that. So let's get started. As Ryan said, I'm a historian of 17th and 18th century France. I teach history and French here at UVA. And I'd like to tell you about the political and institutional world in which Moreau and Racine's Esther was written. Since the season's theme is curated according to Madame de Maintenon, I'll focus more on her world and leave thinking about Handel to other opportunities that we have to continue the discussion. So if you attended the premiere of Moreau and Racine's Esther, if you're there at Saint-Cyr at this school in 1689, you might have been a schoolgirl, you might have been a parent, you might have been a courtier at Versailles, you might have been Louis XIV, the King of France. So the show premiered at this school that Madame de Maintenon famously created. And it's not just any school. So to understand how these audience members might have experienced this show and the performers as well, I think it's helpful to look at exactly what kind of school this was, how it originated, and how it operated. Okay. So hopefully if the tech is working, we're now on my second slide. You can let me know if that's not the case. So Maintenon's school is called the Royal House of Saint-Louis at Saint-Cyr. Royal because the monarchy is funding it. They're sponsoring it. Saint-Louis because of the order of nuns teaching there. And Saint-Cyr, the name of the town in which the school is built. Saint-Cyr is a 4th century child martyr. So maybe the child aspect is sort of fitting for the name of the town. Yet, Madame de Maintenon was not the only high-ranking representative of the Bourbon monarchy to consecrate an elite school in the 1680s that would serve Bourbon interests. One is actually Louis XIV himself, which I'm not going to talk about today, but we can, talk about that later. The second that I do want to talk about is the Cardinal Mazarin. The Cardinal Mazarin, Jules Mazarin, is the head minister of Louis XIV. And he founded this school called the Collège Mazarin that opened 2 years after Saint-Cyr. So in my mind, they go together. And so I'm going to tell you about an all-boys school and an all-girls school to make this comparison. And through this comparison, I'd like to make 2 points for you. The first is that the school at Saint-Cyr, Madame de Maintenon's school, is part of a broader trend of Louis XIV starting to patronize education. It actually is part of a trend that goes back even towards Henry IV earlier. And the purpose, though, that Louis XIV has in mind is to integrate newly acquired provinces, both administratively and culturally, and to bolster this entire class of impoverished lower nobles who were paying for Louis XIV's wars of conquest. The second point is that schooling in general during this period in the late 17th century is organized around the idea of moral instruction. And so because of that context, it's going to be important for us, I think, to consider theater not just as an aesthetic domain, but to really ask questions about the history of morality when we consider these shows. So we want to think about, okay, what does it mean to be a hybrid moral and aesthetic enterprise when you put on a school play? So my first clue that these two schools are doing something kind of similar to each other, that they are serving populations of a comparable status, that they form a common educational project, is the observation that some families began to send their sons to the Collège Mazarin and their daughters to the École at Saint-Cyr, to the Maison Royale. So let me give you all one example. This is a family tree that I found on a genealogist website of the Aumale family, one of the branches of this very large noble family. And I've pulled around for you. Can you all see my mouse here? The mouse moving? Okay, great. So here's a pair of siblings, the very improbably named Scholastique Florence and her brother Charles-François. Scholastique Florence attended the Maison at Saint-Cyr, and her brother was sent to the Collège Mazarin. And I've actually put a star here next to all of the female members of the family that became demoiselles, that were young girls who attended the school of Saint-Cyr. And so the students were actually often related to each other. At least, 40% of the demoiselles, the girls attending Saint-Cyr, were actually closely related to each other, without even accounting for like being distant cousins, of which we have many examples as well. So that tells us that the school's purpose, sociologically and politically, is to help out certain families. They're trying to educate certain particular clans. So what was the Aumale family doing at this school? And by the way, why were there so many impoverished nobles? I mentioned that that's Louis XIV's goal. So to answer that, I hope you'll bear with me for this. We have to talk just for a moment about military history. I promise we're going to get back to opera really soon. So the military angle here is that of the Aumale family, of these siblings, their father, Charles, was a military man. He was the captain of a regiment. He was a lieutenant. And it turns out that nobles had to fund their own regiments from basically the wealth that they produced on their land. And the young Louis XIV, as you may know, was a particularly bellicose monarch. That's something he regretted on his deathbed, and it became very expensive for the nobles in his kingdom to keep funding his wars across Europe. He was also a winning monarch, so he was able to expand his territory pretty significantly in the third quarter of the 17th century. My favorite example of these newly acquired provinces, that is, that he went out and conquered, is still part of France today. And it's a province called Franche-Comté. Some of you may have, has anybody been to Franche-Comté, to Dijon or Besançon? A couple folks. Oh, that's fantastic. So this is my favorite example. The name literally means free county. Besançon is what was called a free imperial city under the Holy Roman Empire, under the German emperor. So it's nominally German, but it's actually quite independent, which is great if you're a local aristocrat, right? You have a lot of independence and privileges until you get conquered by Louis XIV. Here he is on the left, being shown laying siege to Besançon in the 1670s. He acquired the province, made it part of France. And the leaders of Paris actually erected a triumphal arch in the city of Paris on the border of the ring road outside the city that would commemorate this conquest, inscribing the limits of his empire within his capital city. So this is the Porte Saint-Martin. It still stands in Paris today. And I've highlighted for you here because it's kind of hard to see his name in Latin, Louis the Great, Ludovico Magno, and the Latin name for Besançon, which is Westantio, right? So this is a triumphal arch in Paris, in the capital, commemorating his conquest of Franche-Comté. What this means, though, is not everybody's happy with the conquest. If you're an aristocrat from Besançon, it's actually not necessarily a good thing that you're now conquered by this new king, right? That you have to fund armies for and so on. And that's also not necessarily a good thing if you're one of these nobles who had to fund the conquering army. That is to say, that went from France into Franche-Comté to conquer it. So I was very curious about this dynamic. And so for the documentary that Ryan mentioned earlier, to learn more about that moment, I actually went out to Besançon earlier this month to visit the descendants of one of these families of dissatisfied nobles. So I'd like to introduce you briefly to the very charming and hospitable Lionel, the Marquis of Moutier, who you see here with me interviewing. And I'd like to share with you a story that the Marquis told me about his family. Early in the 1700s, he said, after Louis XIV conquered Franche-Comté, his ancestors buried their dead face down to avoid facing the sun as a sign of disrespect for the Sun King, which is how Louis XIV called himself. The family resented giving up their independence to serve the Bourbon monarchy. However, actually, before I get to however, they were right to be anxious. And here's a beautiful picture of their family chateau that I visited. And you can see here at the top is this beautiful 19th century neo-Gothic castle. And down the hill is this unfinished 18th century neoclassical complex. The reason it's unfinished is because in 1735, the family ran out of money because they were funding a cavalry regiment for Louis XV's wars, the next king. Okay, so it was so expensive. So if in 1735 the family ran out of money, how could they educate their daughters? The answer is they sent them to study at the Maison Royale of Saint-Cyr outside of Paris that Madame de Maintenon had funded. So this is part of Louis XIV's foreign policy. It's part of his social policy, cultivating the aristocracy to create schools like Saint-Cyr. And in fact, it's very successful. So within a generation, the daughter who went to Saint-Cyr, she had a son. That son became a diplomat, François-Élie de Moutier. That should say maybe de Moutier, sorry about that, who became important as a diplomat as France's ambassador to America when America created our first constitution. He actually left a couple chairs that are still in the Oval Office today when he went back to France at the end of his term. He was very friendly with George Washington and so on. So in just one generation, right, this family went from burying their dead face down as a sign of disrespect to the monarchy to serving the monarchy. And attendance at Saint-Cyr was part of that pivot of cultural integration into the monarchy. I think part of the reason for this is that the highest nobles, the princes of the blood, who are very closely related to the king, could be competition with the king. They might lead a rebellion or a civil war. This had actually happened during a war called the Fronde in the 1650s. And so Louis needed to shore up support from the nobility who weren't quite able to rival him, but who could still support him. And so he deliberately is trying to shore up this social class. And in fact, the Aumale family is a great example of this as well. I told you about these siblings, Scholastique Florence and Charles François. It turns out that their aunt had attended the Maison at Saint-Cyr. Their aunt is called Marie-Jeanne d'Aumale. And she actually went on to serve the monarchy in an important way. She became the private secretary of Madame de Maintenon. So she's the most important and intimate servant for Maintenon. We know this in a couple ways. She's the one who actually told Madame de Maintenon when Louis XIV had died, allegedly. Madame de Maintenon and Louis XIV burned a lot of their correspondence. Madame de Maintenon told people not to write her directly if they had something important to say that could be intercepted. And she directed them instead to write to Marie-Jeanne d'Aumale, her secretary. It was less likely to be intercepted. So this Aumale family becomes extremely important for Madame de Maintenon and for the French monarchy. And it started with her education at the Maison Royale of Saint-Cyr. I can't resist showing you one more example before we move on. On the left is what the Collège Mazarin looks like today. On the right is a chapel that was built in the 1730s in Besançon, in this newly acquired capital city in the province of Franche-Comté. You can see how similar that they look. This chapel that was built for charity for destitute single women and widows was actually modeled off of the Collège Mazarin. So through this architecture, we can see the influence of the Parisian capital, right, radiating outwards. So let's turn to the two schools now. Cardinal Mazarin had helped to broker these peace agreements in Louis XIV's wars. The treaties, they included the conference at Pheasant Island. You see that depicted here in a painting on the right. This settled peace with Habsburg Spain in part through the young king's first marriage to his Spanish cousin, the Spanish princess. And to solidify the successful legacy of negotiating these peace agreements, Mazarin made provisions in his will to found a school that would target these elite boys from the newly acquired provinces or nations. For that reason, the school came to be known as the Collège des Quatre Nations, the College of Four Nations. And the Cardinal Mazarin had hoped, as the school's founding charter enumerated, that, quote, all these provinces would become French by their own inclination, as much as they currently are by His Majesty's domination. And so what this quote tells you is that he's trying to make a kind of program of cultural integration. It's like a Rhodes Scholarship in reverse. He's trying to kind of bring them into French culture and into the French Empire. So his school opened in 1688, and I should mention that since Napoleon, the building now houses what's called the Institut de France, which includes the Académie Française, France's highest linguistic and literary body. And so it's my favorite building in Paris. You can still go in and visit the chapel on Saturdays. Anyway, back to the school in 1688. 60 boarding students, all boys, would study Latin, a little Greek, Christian texts, increasingly mathematics and engineering into the early 18th century before attending higher studies in theology or law or medicine. Some of them would join the military. And in fact, Charles-François d'Aumale, who I referred to earlier, he did just that. And he got a great gig. Let me tell you, he became the director of fortifications on the French Riviera, right? In Provence. It wasn't the Riviera quite yet, but it was still beautiful. And of course, also in Besançon, actually, he directed the citadel there. Today, the Collège Mazarin is in the center of Paris. At the time, it was actually on the outskirts of the city, on the city limits. And in red on this map on the left, you can see some of the other collèges, these kind of elite classical high schools in Paris. You can see there's this new school is sitting at a remove from the center of the Latin Quarter. Now, Mazarin wanted more for these young people than just successful careers in the French administration as military engineers and cavalry regiment leaders and so forth. The monarchy had to teach provincial elites to adopt French mœurs et coutumes, so mores and customs. We might translate that simply as culture. As the founding contract spelled out, the school aimed to teach proper moral behavior, or mœurs. This is a very almost untranslatable word that meant a kind of ethical orientation to pleasure. It meant your own ethos, your way of being in the world. It includes aspects of what we today would call gender and sexuality, religion, race, and culture. So it's quite a multifaceted concept that's a little bit foreign to us today. In any case, students at the school learned virtuous manners by studying models worthy of emulation from the Latin and Greek classics, from Christian morality, as well as by attending chapel as a class. You know, so they would march in double file lines. They also performed theater, usually a tragedy, at the end of the school year in August, when they would award prizes, book prizes, to the top students. Now, administrators at this school worked extremely hard to ensure that students would not become corrupted by alcohol, by pornography, by materialist philosophy, by sodomy. This is the term that they use to talk about homosexuality. And so they gave incentives to their star students and a whole range of punishments for rebellious students. That would include, for instance, expulsion or banishment from Paris, all kinds of things. They would also, teachers would work in secret with parents, right, to correct students' behavior. Their curriculum, their disciplinary apparatus at the school, this is all geared towards shaping students' sense of culture to fit the mold of what it meant to be a proper French aristocrat. So this kind of moral vision is part of this process of almost nationalist integration into the French kingdom. And that's why I've highlighted these two parts of the quote from the founding documents of the school. Turning to Saint-Cyr, I would say analogous dynamics played out at the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis in the town of Saint-Cyr. But in contrast, Cardinal Mazarin's school was founded by his will when he passed away. Madame de Maintenon took an active role in her school because she was still alive. She was a teacher. She was fundamentally an educator at heart. And she took an active role in all kinds of ways in the school, in designing curricula. She visited classes. She mentored the instructors. She mentored the girls, the demoiselles. And she also wrote on educational philosophy herself and developed lessons in the form of dialogues. She wrote conversations. She wrote lectures. She compiled proverbs and maxims and commentaries on classical texts. So she deserves to really be placed in the canon of educational theorists of this kind of late Renaissance pre-Enlightenment moment. So Saint-Cyr housed 250 demoiselles, 36 teachers, 24 nuns of the Order of Saint-Louis. The girls were broken up into generally 4 groups based on age group, and they were distinguished by the color of the ribbon that they wore. So the youngest in red up to these older girls in blue, who are really young women at this point, preparing themselves for integration into adult life. Their curriculum was pretty wide-ranging. You may be surprised to see that they studied some Latin there as well, which is relatively unusual for women's academies in the 17th century. I'm not going to dwell too long on this list. What's important to take away, though, is that right from the beginning, the school made clear that they're training girls for 2 purposes: to become nuns or to become mothers. And everything they're doing at this school is somehow organized around these 2 possible ends. As one scholar has written, the curriculum was designed to enforce rather than to undermine patriarchal values. So when we consider that this is the goal of the school, that included basically everything that they did in this school, including theater, including music. And this is also concerned in a way with shaping girls' sense of being a girl, of gender. Madame de Maintenon wrote, "Because God had you be born demoiselle, you should have the manners of them. That is to say, act like a girl. You should learn how to do this. It's not something that's natural. It's something that has to be cultivated. She taught girls how to write in a kind of Attic rhetorical style. That is to say, not modeled off of the florid prose of Ciceronian Latin, but rather of the no-frills, simple, direct register of Athenian orators, appropriate to their station, appropriate to their gender, and appropriate to her aesthetic sensibilities. Now, as I mentioned, at the end of the year, schools in general during this period would put on a play, usually a serious tragedy. After the 1740s, we start to see more comedy, more contemporary subjects, and more contemporary kind of active playwrights making a name for it. So Voltaire, for instance, will write one for a collège during his time. They would give prizes also to the top students to be awarded a book. This is actually a pretty expensive object in the 17th century. What's important to note is that in the casts of these shows, you have the sons and at Saint-Cyr, the daughters of the great noble families, just as their parents might perform on stage at Versailles, at court, with Louis XIV, for instance, right? Who maybe some of you have seen this famous image of Louis XIV kind of dressed as Apollo for the ballet. But this theater is supposed to be fun and exciting for them. It really beats declining Latin nouns all morning, right? But it's also intended to be morally instructive. As child actors, they inhabited their characters. They tested out what it felt like to be a virtuous, heroic woman, to be a wicked villain. They learned the habits and gestures of virtue and devotion, first as acting, but maybe that artifice could somehow become real. In the sense that in the Baroque period, that we think that they're so concerned with artifice and surface all the time. But in a way, this is there's a kind of depth of ethics and morality in that aesthetic for them. So that's part of why Madame de Maintenon is so concerned, for instance, with spelling. This is one of the things she writes about again and again, is teaching girls how to spell well as a reflection of their inner character. But that also means that the entire genre of school theater is shaped by the educational imperatives of these institutions, their sort of moral goals, and of course, debates over what they could and could not depict on stage. One example of this that my senior colleague Julia Prest has brilliantly written about is that schools have a gender problem when it comes to theater. To perform an interesting story with virtuous heterosexual characters, you have to have both men and women represented on stage. At an all-boys school, you end up having, that means drag, right? You have to have some men wearing women's dress. This is an extremely ethically fraught terrain that commentators write about quite a bit between 1680 and 1730. At a single-sex school, that's the kind of implication. There's a kind of no-no there. That dynamic plays out in a slightly different way at Saint-Cyr, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Saint-Cyr performed theater too, and performing implies an audience. This is a little bit tricky because the school was from the beginning seen as a kind of sanctuary for Madame de Maintenon. So this is a kind of retreat for her from court society, like what the Petit Trianon might become for Marie Antoinette later. But it could never fully be that, right? It became a part of court life very quickly. By a show of hands, for those of you listening, how many of you have been to Versailles? Maybe you could hit a reaction button or throw your hands up or something like that. Okay, a lot of you have visited Versailles. So if you walk out the back door of the chateau and you walk through the Grande Allée and you're moving through the park, right, past the Fountain of Latona and so on, and get to the end of the park, you're actually quite close to the Maison Royale de Saint-Cyr at that point. I've shown for you the kind of screenshot of Google Maps with an orientation of the Versailles Chateau. I'm sorry, it's hard to see there, but you can see that the distance is actually not so far. It's about 3 miles. You could walk that in about an hour. And if you're traveling by coach, it would be much faster. That presented both opportunities and challenges. So Louis XIV actually came to Sunday Mass to visit the school. This is depicted in the engraving that I'm showing you here. It also meant that the arrow could go in the opposite direction, that girls could walk from Saint-Cyr, from school, and just walk out of the school and walk to the royal court at Versailles. And there's a lot happening at Versailles. It's basically a town of about 10,000 people kind of living in this court society together. And that could be pretty dangerous. So I went out to the school at Saint-Cyr earlier this month to have some photos to show you all. Here you're looking at the front gate of the school. And in the left photo, you're seeing the outside of the chapel where Louis XIV and Madame de Maintenon would have attended mass together on Sundays. And I can say more about my visit to the site today a little later. And here is the map from the 17th century with arrows kind of showing you the orientation of these two photos. So Esther's premiere. So Esther's premiere was where school culture and this culture of performing morally productive theater and court culture, the world of Versailles that was so close to the school, really collided. And if you saw Christine Adams and Don Faber's talk on Zoom back in the fall, you'll remember the story of Esther's premiere. So at Saint-Cyr, where girls are supposed to renounce worldly pleasures, Madame de Maintenon spent a fortune outfitting the girls in diamonds and expensive court outfits. The show was too successful. I remember Christine saying it went to the girls' heads. In fact, Madame de Maintenon said so herself. She said that the girls were obsessing over theater now and that their spiritual life suffered, that they were neglecting their spiritual duties. I might also question this story from Madame de Maintenon and wonder if this is a sort of misogynistic historical narrative to blame the girls at Saint-Cyr for what happened and not the male courtiers at Versailles kind of ogling them from the audience. I just don't know, where, we would really want to place the blame. But a second issue is that Esther is clearly the virtuous winner in the story, right? In the show itself. But folks in the audience thought that it was a kind of thinly veiled allegory for Madame de Maintenon herself, and that Vashti was a caricature of Montespan, her predecessor as the king's mistress. Whatever the reason that we want to go with here, Madame de Maintenon does not let the girls perform for the court again. There's reason to believe that she kind of steps back from this pedagogical direction, right? From saying that performing for other people will be a pedagogically productive exercise for them, that it can do more harm than good, I think is her takeaway. So as you watch the show next week at the Terrace Theater at the Kennedy Center, for those of you in DC, I encourage you to try to inhabit the mindset of a young girl experiencing for the first time this wider social world. A young girl maybe whose family has is writing a new story for themselves that's deeply connected with the story of the Bourbon monarchy. I'd like to ask you to watch the characters and think about whether they're exhibiting behavior that Madame de Maintenon would have wanted for virtuous French women. So behavior including characteristics of a noble race, of whiteness, of heterosexuality, right? How might these characters have been played in this courtly context? And just as we might read a biography, and as you read, you sort of ask yourself how you might respond in a situation that the subject of the biography was in, right? How might you have fared? Theater going is similarly an activity that commanded the attention of performers and spectators with an aim towards their moral development. So as such, I think we should appreciate these 17th century theatrical arts as a kind of moral science before the moral sciences become a separate discipline in the 19th century, and appreciate them not just on aesthetic terms. I know I might get into hot water with the musicologists here for saying that, but we can also appreciate the political institutions that shaped what stories were important to tell on stage and how they were told. This tight control over media, over theater wouldn't last, nor would the vision of these moral rigorists for what constituted virtuous behavior. The French Revolution, following Enlightenment principles, really put an end to that. That's not what you're looking at on this slide, though. We know both schools represented the old regime in a way, the power of the monarchy, the aristocratic order, the power of the church. And in the minds of the French people, the schools represented those things. And we can tell this because the schools were both ransacked in the French Revolution, both of them. Napoleon turned Saint-Cyr into a military school, and actually Nazis occupied the building, right, when they invaded France. And what you're looking at on this slide is the extensive damage that the school at Saint-Cyr suffered during Allied bombings during World War II. So this is maybe Americans. I'm not exactly sure. This could be us. And it was rebuilt again in the post-war years as a military high school, which it still is today. But the memory of the girls' school remains alive in an interesting way. They've renamed the street that goes around the school as the Street of the Demoiselles de Saint-Cyr, and it also remains alive today in Opera Lafayette's production. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. I'm so interested in what happens to a person. I mean, as a performer myself, what happens to a person when you identify with a role? And I know what some of the operas that have meant so much to me, and empathizing with each of the characters and the kind of situations. And I thought maybe that would be a great thing for us to ask Jonathan to speak about, because Jonathan I should say that the role that Jonathan plays in our concert of Haman, the evil guy, only doesn't show up as a musical character in the Moreau. We only have the young women, as you said. We only have the young women as Israelites and singing in our concert. Although I'm struck by the really deeply emotional things that they're asked to sing, whether it be about crying and moaning, or about supplication to God, praying, or about fighting or about happiness. It's clear that their acts, they have to get up there and be highly emotional, vulnerable, and expressive characters. But they don't have to play the evil guy. And maybe, Jonathan, that could be an introduction to what you do in Handel's Handel's Esther.
Sure. And hi, everybody. Lovely to see you. And thank you, Ben. That was really fascinating, and learned a lot. Yes. So Handel's production of this same play, translated into English, does include several characters that would be portrayed by men. And actually, Ben, I'm going to ask you later about that at the school at Saint-Cyr, because you mentioned that when men play female characters, sometimes they maybe had to dress up as women, but I'm wondering if the opposite happened. But at any rate, I sing the character of Haman in the Esther story. And Haman is, he's not a king. He's a prime minister, you could say. He's an advisor to King Ahasuerus, otherwise known as Xerxes, if you know your kind of Persian history. And as a result, one of the things I like to think about, I should say that as a bass baritone, I play a lot of characters who are the bad guy in 17th and 18th century music. That just tends to be how the voice parts get distributed. And so I often think about, like, what is motivating this character other than just being a very stereotypical bad guy? Why is he making his decisions? And if you think about politics and you think about the relationship of power between, let's say, a monarch, somebody like Louis XIV, or somebody like Xerxes, who would, thousands of years earlier, they have a way of being able to exist as this sort of pristine image of power. But then the actual application of power comes to the people who support them, to their counselors and their courtiers. And so, yes, my role as Haman is one of these counselors, and it's Haman ultimately who makes the decision to condemn the Jewish people to death. And it's because of a personal slight against him from the character Mordecai, who is, sort of another of these community leaders. And so it's not so much that the king himself had this issue with the Jewish people. In fact, he, as you'll see in the story, he sort of comes around and forgives them in the end. But Haman is the one who wants to execute the king's power, who wants to use the king's power towards his own ends. And I find that very fascinating, because I think that's one of the things that is still going on, today. People surround themselves, or people attach themselves to very powerful people so that they can manifest their own agendas. And in the story of Esther that the Handel oratorio depicts, the tables turn on Haman entirely once it is revealed that Esther, number one, is Jewish, and number two, goes to the king to have this decree overturned. He sort of grants her wish instantaneously. And Haman's position goes from being at the right hand of the king to basically being, he is the one who will be put to death. And one of the things that Handel does so incredibly well, and which you will hear if you're at one of our performances, is that when my character initially is introduced, it's with an aria where he is calling for the punishment of the Jews, and this aria is strong and it's mighty, and it's the text is pluck, root, and branch, and it's set in this very militaristic sort of way. And then towards the end of the piece, when Haman is now he's in the supplicant position, he's now pleading for his life, you have two incredible lamentation type pieces of very, very sorrowful writing from Handel. You have one where he begs the queen directly for forgiveness. Turn not, O queen, your face away. And then once it is known to him that he has no chance of surviving, once he sort of realizes his fate is sealed, he sings an aria that's really incredible called How Art Thou Fallen? And it uses, as Handel so often does, this beautiful text painting of a descending line falling from a great height. And it's the story basically of his ambition having gotten the better of him. And I find this depiction of these events and these power dynamics to be, on the one hand, timeless. The Esther story comes from the Old Testament. It's some of the oldest bit of culture that we still to this day, can kind of connect to. And yet these same stories of a mighty person falling from grace are happening around us as we speak, and sort of have continued to do so. And of course, they would have very clearly, there would have been very, very clear references, both, I imagine, in Louis' France, and also in King George's England, only a few decades later. And so, yeah, I find the timelessness of power struggles to be one of the most fascinating things about Baroque opera, about taking ancient stories, telling them in the 17th and the 18th century, and now we do them today, and somehow there's a through line of relevance.
Oh, that's great. That's Ben. I know that you had some questions of Jonathan. I think you wanted to pose to him about.
Absolutely. Well, I wanted to ask you about your sense of being a performer and your sense of being a human person. One of the threads that I was interested in my talk is the idea that performance in the 17th century you're not just bracketing a kind of recreational activity and then you leave the stage and you become yourself again. And I was curious if your training as a performer has affected your sense of self in some way. Like, do you ever kind of hang out with friends or go about the world and realize that you've just made some kind of gesture that you are trained to do? Or do you have a kind of heightened awareness of your own both comportment and deportment in a way that us lay people may not have?
Well, that's a great question, Ben. And I think, there are certainly some stereotypes. If you've ever gotten to know musicians, there are definitely some stereotypes about singers, and particularly opera singers, and how we kind of embody drama as we move through our day-to-day lives. So I think absolutely part of studying performing, and I started studying performing at a really young age. I was always a musician from my earliest childhood, but I also actually studied some acting and theater as a kid at about age 12. Um, was in a few musicals and things like that. And yeah, I would say that one of the first things that you learn, and perhaps even learn is a strong word because I think at that age, you're not conscious of it, but is basically that theater and performance can be a place where you can sort of funnel all of these characteristics about yourself. And maybe that's why certain types of people are drawn to it. Those of us who perhaps do feel like we have to live sensationally or live out loud or have, as we experience, what we go through. I think for me, I guess I'll speak for myself. For me as a performer, like being able to express that is a way that helps me deal with my emotions. I know that maybe that's not true for everyone, but for me, it really is. And particularly, like I was saying about the character that I'm playing in the Handel, when these characters are complex or when their motivations are complex, to me, that is always very interesting because I think it helps me wrestle with the complexity of living in the modern world and of making moral and ethical choices, as you referenced so eloquently, in terms of society working together to kind of create a morality in the 17th century in France. I think nowadays there are certainly ways that happens, but I think it's a little bit more diffuse. I think it's a little bit of a choose your own adventure in terms of morality in contemporary American life. I mean, certainly there are still people who have very traditional points of view, and then I think there are people who maybe have thrown all of that out and are crafting their own moral compass as they go. And so for me, somewhere in between, perhaps, I like performing because it gives me a vessel to sort of use, to kind of figure some of those things out. Yeah.
I love the comparison. Oh, sorry.
Oh no, it was interesting you were talking about, age, because of course there's a huge discussion these days about what's appropriate for whom to express where at what age. And we have, in addition to Ben writing about this program, Philip Kennicott, the cultural critic for the Washington Post, has written about the program for us, and discussed the parallels of young people having to putting themselves out and personally in social media today, and how the same kind of conflicts that we're hearing and the same criticisms that we're hearing and the same anxieties that we're hearing associated with that were what was discussed after the performance of Esther at Saint-Cyr for these young women. And so it's a fascinating and kind of hot topic. But Ben, you were going to say.
Well, I was going to pick up on the comparison that Jonathan made between the cultural world of Versailles and our own world today. This is less controversial of a statement in America than it is among some of my friends in France, but I happen to enjoy not living under an absolutist monarchy. Right. And so I guess my question for you, Jonathan, that your point made me think of is what the value for you is of work like Esther coming out of Saint-Cyr, or even Handel's work. Like I remember, Rodelinda, for instance, is sort of overtly absolutist, right? It sort of is ending on this note of, oh, but we all defer to the king, right? And this is a kind of world where maybe it reminds me of a little bit of the Idylle sur la Paix that you have just recorded in Germany this week that we were talking about earlier. So what's the value for you of this cultural work that's designed to kind of encourage conformity in a way that's foreign to maybe our own habits and our own culture?
That is a really great question. And I think that is something that, now we're getting a little more niche. I think that's something that early music performers look at a lot. we are often drawn to these works because we appreciate their aesthetic beauty. But as you said, these things sometimes go further than aesthetics, and they tell a story, and depending on how you present it, it can offer an endorsement of a particular point of view. And I think, thank you for mentioning the Idil sur la Paix. I want to give a shout out to Anne, who I think is here. A couple of weeks ago, if you were here for her really also very fascinating and enlightening talk, she mentioned that Racine did write another libretto for a piece of sort of theater set to music, although it's hard to call it theater really. And that's Idil sur la Paix by Louis, which is really just a kind of celebration of how wonderful the king is. And so, like you say, Ben, it's really kind of foreign to us nowadays to spend, to take the time and the energy to create an entire work just propping up, sort of one absolutist political figure. And yet, if you think again about like how we exist in the modern world, I think there are still a lot of parallels to that. I mean, there are still, I think people, even if we like the idea that we, for example, in the United States, we vote for the president, people often have cult-like followings to their political leader of choice. And I'm not even necessarily referring, to the current or most recent occupants of the White House. I mean, I think that's been happening, for decades in the United States. People have their president that they, have a picture of over their couch in their living room. And that's, it almost occupies the same role in someone's mind.
But people even back then, I think when Anne was mentioning it, wasn't she mentioning the fact that Racine hated to do that kind of stuff? That he wasn't really interested in it back in the 17th century either. He was sort of under duress or a gig he couldn't refuse kind of thing, right?
And this has also always been the dilemma of the performing artist. We are reliant on a sort of a version of a patronage system, which used to be very direct, and it was the king and the nobles who paid. Nowadays, it is often folks who are philanthropists and who are willing to kind of give to the arts so that the entire community can benefit from the work of artists. But it's still a situation where you sort of have to make compromises about what you say and do so that the funding doesn't dry up. And Anne, I would love if you wanted to chime in about Idil.
And if there are any questions, maybe this is a good time to open it up to comments from or questions from the audience too. So you can either just show yourself and or put the question in the chat, and Jace will relay it to us, or just show yourself and ask our guests here. Lisa has a question.
It was interesting to hear the conversation about the morality of these women and what the young women and what they were learning. And as we spoke about the boys' school versus the women's school, I'm wondering if any such claims were weighed upon the gentlemen when they performed. Did they feel too much of themselves, or feel too good about themselves, or lose their virtuosity as a result of performances?
I don't think that in late 17th, early 18th century France, there was a way for a young nobleman to feel too good about himself, right? These are the people who are supposed to feel empowered. I will say that, in my dissertation research on the Collège Mazarin that I spoke about, it's actually interesting. Ryan and I were talking. I haven't done enough reading about the theater that was performed there, and that's why I'm so excited to, to kind of, it's kind of a continued journey, right? To look at these different aspects of the school. I did spend a lot of time basically reading everything that has been produced by the disciplinary overseers of the school, and the school curricula. And what I found is that the professors and school board worked very closely with none other than the Lieutenant General of Police of Paris to ensure the kind of moral safety of these young men, to not be tempted into the vices of the city. Because unlike Saint-Cyr, the Collège Mazarin is still in the city of Paris. And so it's really the city and cosmopolitanism and nascent capitalism that present the most dangers to these young men. And it's kind of a different set of pleasures than what the demoiselle at Saint-Cyr might find at court. So it's a different kind of corruption that's really at stake.
You also didn't you also talk about the play of David and Jonathan?
Oh, that's right.
And how that being something that was set by Charpentier in the 17th century France, but also later by Handel, that the content of the work for the men changes according to the morality of surrounding morality as well.
I think there's a topic that deserves further study, is to compare the different settings of the same biblical story in different contexts. I would love to see more synthetic work and research in that area. I mean, we still have a lot to learn. I think as Anne Piéjou and other of the scholars who have come before me to be publishing around the life at these schools and about theater, David and Jonathan, that is to say the biblical King David and Saul, this is kind of the most popular story at these boys' schools in the late 17th and early 18th century. I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that there's a longer tradition in the philosophy classes at these schools of using friendship as a topic to learn about philosophy. This is one of the oldest topics in ethics. Plato's dialogues, he has 3 dialogues that deal with friendship. The Symposium, Lysis, and Phaedrus, I think it is. Aristotle speaks extensively about friendship. And this gets kind of filtered through a kind of ethics and literary lens and sort of applied to stories from the Old Testament. And David and Jonathan becomes the quintessential example of what's called Aristotelian perfect friendship, which is sometimes translated as true friendship. And so and because you don't need to have women on stage, it becomes a very convenient solution to a number of different problems at once. And of course, they usually play out this drama of Jonathan's duty towards his father and his role in the line of succession played against his affection for his perfect friend, David. So it's a kind of quintessential Baroque trope of, love against duty. Anne, did you want to come in on that?
Oh, yes, thank you, Ben.
Please, yeah.
Yes, I think that the gender issue in performing, well, I should add that it's not the same thing for a girl performing a male character, and which was not a problem from a moral point of view, while performing a female character in male colleges has always been a problem. I mean,
so that's historically
it's not symmetrical.
And do you remember who performed Haman and Ahasuerus in the 1689 production, by any chance? Do you remember if they were?
I can find it, but
yeah.
She does say in the text, though, that Judith, she refers to the male characters, and Haman's voice and performance in the Saint-Cyr performance was appreciated by the audience, but the music was just written for female voices, are the points that you made in the text, Anne. Yeah. And
so would those actors have been the voice, the people speaking the roles, would they have been students at Saint-Cyr as well, young women who were students at Saint-Cyr, or would they have had other adult actors who would have come from the city of Paris, for example?
I'm happy to speak, but this is really Anne is like the world expert. So.
I think she's answered in the text. I think she said specifically the girls portrayed the men. But she also referred last week, to to some professionals coming in and
Yes, but female professionals.
female. Yeah, so,
Yeah.
I actually, I had a question for Ben or Anne, either of you. You mentioned some of the careers that the gentleman from the College Mazarin went on to do. I'm wondering, were there any women from Saint-Cyr who perhaps ventured away from their expectation to either be a nun or a mother, and instead went into some other kind of career? For example, perhaps a performer, an opera singer, or something like that. Were there any women who trained at Saint-Cyr who went on to have a sort of quote unquote scandalous career?
Well, at the beginning of Saint-Cyr, in the late 17th century, no, because, as you know, performing was not really appreciated by the nobility, the aristocracy. And these women were prepared, as Ben said, to be nuns or mothers back in their returns. No,
were you
it would have been a scandal, actually.
And in fact, if you read the educational writings by Madame de Maintenon, so the speeches that she gave to the girls and the ways that she instructed them, she's very clear to them that, like, as young women, you do not exist alone by yourself in the world. It is impossible. You are constrained by the institutions of the monastic life of a female religious or your husband. But until that point, you belong to your family and this school, right? So they have a tremendous institutional pressure that I think would change considerably over the course of the Enlightenment and over the course of the 18th century.
Yes, of course. Yes, as a woman, you don't exist at that time in that house, of course, as a young woman. But as an aristocrat, you don't have to work, and you can't work because of your social status. So the point is that there were many female musicians, and it's quite difficult to to follow them in the archives, in the memories of the time. But of course, one could have a salon or play or sing out from the stage, the public stage, but they were very good performers. So that was a way to perform without being a professional, because a professional would be on opera and so.
Which one of our scholars recently wrote about, and this is sort of a defense of a law that I don't know if it was Louis XIV or early in his life. He put forward something that said that actors and singers would have some level of legitimacy or respect that, I mean, it's, of course, everybody turns into guilds and this kind of thing, but there was something from on high, from a law coming from Louis XIV, wasn't there, that would give legitimacy to actors and actresses?
Yes, that's true, but he paid for the careers of the best female singers at the same time.
Also, right, of course.
So,
yeah.
Hilaire Dupuis, Lily's aunt, was paid all her life long by the king.
Right. I thought there was something that actually addressed their whole class of being an actor or an actress and protected them somehow on some level. And I can't remember where I read that.
Yes, they were not. Yes, by the king, yes, by the church, no.
Do we have
the king protected several performers, of course.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask if we have another question from the audience.
Oh, Jill's
I
got
have
one.
a
I do have
comment
another question for you. Sorry. But Jill, please.
No, well, I just wanted to say that I always like to hear the group comment on the relevance of these ancient works to today's way of life. And Jonathan, what you said in your initial comments, I found really great in drawing the parallels, but just listening to Saint-Cyr and the education of women in this era. I went to an all-girls college that's like, over 100 years old. And I have to say that while it's not this way today, at its founding, I think there were, some similar issues that confronted women, not, that you had to be a nun or a mother. It didn't have to be as draconian as that, but, exploring, was marriage the end all and be all, or this kind of thing. And even though Wellesley was founded by a man who wanted to ensure that women would have the level of education that was only offered to men at the time, I think, initially some of these things are transferable even to as recent a time as that. So it's just interesting for me to hear about Madame de Maintenon and what she was educating her students about. And it's not that alien to me.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a timeless aspect to institutions that are organized around serving a single gender, that we see some kind of recurrent strategies, recurring problems that are dealt with in different ways.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my question. I went to all boys high school, and I was actually going to ask, because you spoke just briefly about the legacy of these two schools and how they changed quite a bit after the revolution. I'm wondering, are there any modern day educational principles that sort of trace their origin back to this time period?
That's a great question. There are a lot of ideas that emerge from the educational milieu during this period. So it becomes very popular in aesthetic theory to talk about ideas that they're talking about in schools. Ideas like the expression je ne sais quoi comes from this period, right? To express the aesthetic ineffable. John Locke has this idea of a tabula rasa, that the mind is a blank slate at birth. And this really takes off because British schoolboys in 1705 or 1690, it gets translated into French in 1705-6. That's what I'm thinking of it. They would all learn to write on a chalkboard. So you write ABC and then you erase the chalkboard. So tabula rasa is a very kind of easy metaphor for them. So we have all these kinds of expressions that come out of this moment. But your broader question about sort of pedagogy, I'd have to think a little bit more about. It's clear that Rousseau is by far the more kind of influential theorist of child rearing and education, but I'm not willing to kind of say that Fenelon isn't also, doesn't also belong there.
Yeah, and Philip in his essay for us talks a lot about Rousseau and Emily too. So he picks up on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'll have to think more about your question. That's a great question.
My great aunt, very similar to Madame de Maintenon, taught me that spelling was essential to having a career. So I thought that was an interesting point.
Too bad she's not around today to do a lot of editing. So,
did we see another question?
I say, Nizam, I saw your hand up if you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to dovetail on Gilles' comment, where she said that the founder of Wellesley College wanted to ensure that the women of his days would receive the same kind of education as a male of his days. But I think that was also what was behind Madame de Maintenon's idea in educating the girls of Saint-Cyr. Is yeah, sure, they had to choose between being a nun or a wife, but that was a wife that would have been just as educated as her husband instead of as dumb as they used to be.
That's exactly right. And in fact, I think in the educational theorists that I've been reading, this is how they justify it. This is how they sort of launder it in. I mean, you read folks like Aristotle who are going to say that women aren't capable, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's really heavy stuff. But then you'll have someone, come along and say, well, actually, women need to have the same education to be extremely well educated so that they can teach their sons. And so they still justify it in male terms, but this gives them the kind of entry point to justify what I think they want to do anyway, which is like send girls to school and, get to read classics. It's good for everybody. Yeah.
Have you or rather Anne Piéjus followed the graduates from Saint-Cyr and tried to link them to the enlightened period where a lot of women had salons? Were those salonières products of Saint-Cyr?
And would you like to respond, or?
Maybe I don't understand the link between Saint-Cyr and salons, because at the beginning Saint-Cyr was quite open, but then it became a convent, so the girls didn't get into the world anymore.
They didn't get married.
Less and less, time passing.
I do have an answer to your question in reference more specifically to the Collège Mazarin and the other collège through Paris, which is that they play a paradoxical role in the Enlightenment. On the one hand, the professors there fill the ranks of the opponents of the Enlightenment. So at the Collège Mazarin, for instance, Ambroise Ribaillet, I think his name is one of the great polemical opponents of Voltaire in the second half of the 18th century. At the same time, all of the students who become later in life the Enlightenment philosophes, but especially the participatory reading public who get to know these Enlightenment philosophers, all got their education at institutions like this. And so the role is very ambivalent. On the one hand, you can sort of read what is being taught in these schools, but then you have folks like D'Alembert, who's another alum of the Collège Mazarin, right? And studies, and he actually writes the article Collège for the Encyclopédie, this kind of great Enlightenment work. And in this article, he is a fascinating text, but one of his complaints is not actually that the collège is too religious and it's too restrictive and it's too morally rigorous. His complaint is actually that they don't go fast enough in class for the smartest students. So he has this kind of perverse relationship where he actually recognizes the value of the education that he received, but he disagrees with the kind of the priggish moralism or moralizing of the older generation that really came of age kind of in the 1690s. He's this kind of new Enlightenment cohort that has a different orientation to authority.
But couldn't we say that critical thinking has come through education?
I think that's exactly right. And among historians in my field right now, the trend is very much to try to emphasize and show that every time Enlightenment philosophers try to tell you that they're making a firm break from the 17th century and that they're finally enlightened compared with the Grand Siècle, they're actually taking their tools of textual criticism and manipulation from moral theologians in the 1640s through 70s. There's a historian of ideas called Jean-Louis Quentin who's done particularly tremendous work in that, very fine-grained, nitty-gritty intellectual history. And so I think we can actually recognize more continuities with this kind of 17th century theater world into the 18th century than maybe previously might have been recognized.
Well, thank you, Ben, and Jonathan, very much.
Yeah, I was going to say it's 7:15, so I don't want to hold you guys any longer than necessary, but that was fantastic. Thank you so much. I don't see any more questions in the chat. If anyone has one last question, maybe we can answer, but other than that, I would love to say thank you all for joining us, and we really hope to see you next week.
And in May, when we do it in New York.
Yes, in May.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.